He laughed. That was the part Charlotte could never stop hearing. Not the words themselves, though the words were bad enough. It was the laugh, easy, unbothered, the kind of laugh a man makes when something is so obviously ridiculous it barely deserves a response. She's my wife on paper, nothing more. She was standing 6 feet from the door, close enough to hear every syllable, far enough that no one saw her face fall apart. 3 years. One night that changed everything, and a sentence that took 11 seconds to destroy it all. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel invisible the moment it cost them something, you already know exactly how Charlotte felt standing in that hallway. The question isn't whether she survived it. The question is what she did next. If this story already has your heart, hit that like button right now, drop your city or country in the comments below, and subscribe so you never miss what's coming, because this one goes places you won't see coming. The night that started everything began with rain. Not the soft, cinematic kind that makes people look beautiful and melancholy standing by windows. This was Chicago rain, so mean and sideways, the kind that finds every gap in your umbrella and soaks through your shoes before you make it half a block. Charlotte had been in Chicago for 3 years by then, and she still hadn't fully made peace with its winters, its wind, or its particular brand of misery that arrived every November and didn't leave until it felt like it. She was closing the cafe when the storm hit hard enough to rattle the front windows. The cafe was hers, had been hers for almost 2 years, built from nothing but stubbornness and savings she'd been grinding towards since she was 19 years old in Boston. It wasn't large. 12 tables, an espresso machine she'd paid too much for, a back wall covered in mismatched frames because she'd never been able to pick a theme and eventually stopped trying. It smelled like dark roast and cinnamon year-round, and it was the one place in Chicago where Charlotte Whitmore, or Charlotte Calloway, depending on which version of her life you were looking at, felt completely like herself. She locked the front door at 7:43, turned off the lights one by one, and stood in the dark for a moment the way she sometimes did. Not out of sadness, exactly. More like ceremony. Acknowledgement that the day had been real, and now it was over. Then she pulled her coat on and went home to the mansion she shared with a man she barely knew. That was the marriage. That was the arrangement. 3 years in, and she still sometimes had to remind herself of the shape of it, the clean transactional outline that had made sense to both of them at the start. Damian Calloway had inherited his father's organization when he was 29 years old. Youngest boss in the city's recent memory, by most accounts. And that distinction came with problems nobody warned him about in the handoff. The men who worked for his father had spent decades respecting a certain kind of authority. Older, harder, proven. Damien was smart, and he was ruthless when he needed to be, but he understood optics. He understood that perception shapes reality in his world just as much as actual power does. And the perception of a young, unmarried man running a criminal empire was complicated. His lawyer had introduced them at a function Charlotte barely remembered now. She'd been 2 years into her visa situation, dealing with a bureaucratic nightmare that threatened to derail everything she'd built, and Damien had been in need of something that looked like stability. The word arrangement had been used. The word mutual had been used a lot. There had been papers and a quiet ceremony with no guests except the 2 attorneys, and afterward they'd driven to the mansion in separate cars. She took the east bedroom. He took the west. They shared a kitchen, a living room, a last name, and very little else. It wasn't a bad life, she'd told herself often enough that she'd almost started believing it. The mansion was beautiful in a way that felt almost irrelevant. Too many rooms, too much polished stone, too much silence. She had her cafe. She had her independence. She had legal standing in a country she'd chosen, and a husband who left her completely alone, which was a mercy she didn't underestimate. But there's a difference between lonely and alone, and Charlotte had been learning that difference very slowly over 3 years. She was thinking about it on the walk home, the rain soaking through the left shoulder of her coat despite the umbrella, her boots getting heavy. When she turned onto their street and saw the lights on in the kitchen, Damien's car was in the drive. She stopped walking. He was never home before 9, usually later, sometimes not at all, in which case she'd find evidence of him in the morning. A coffee cup on the counter, different from the one she'd left, a tie draped over the back of a chair. Ghost traces of a person she lived with but did not know. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than made sense, rain tapping her umbrella, trying to figure out why the sight of lights in her own kitchen made her nervous. Then she went inside. He was standing at the stove with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, doing something with a pan that smelled aggressively like garlic, and something she couldn't immediately identify. He heard the door, glanced back over his shoulder, and turned back to the stove. Power went out at the club, he said, like this explained everything. Generator issue. Okay, Charlotte said. She stood in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen, dripping slightly, still holding the umbrella she'd forgotten to close. You can put the umbrella in the stand, he said, without turning around. She put the umbrella in the stand. She took off her coat. She hung it up. She stood in the kitchen doorway again and watched him cook, because she didn't know what else to do with herself, and going upstairs felt like an overreaction to something that wasn't, technically, a situation. Do you cook? She asked, because the question was right there. Occasionally. He adjusted the heat without looking at the dial. He ate like a person who was actually hungry, which she found oddly humanizing. She'd seen him at charity dinners and business functions, where he ate like eating was something to get through. This was different. You don't like the fennel, she said. He glanced up. How can you tell? You've moved it to the side of your plate 3 times. He looked at his plate. My mother put fennel in everything. I've never liked it. Why didn't you leave it out? I keep thinking I'll learn to like it. I haven't. She almost laughed. Not because it was particularly funny, but because it was the most ordinary thing she'd ever heard him say. That's very stubborn of you, she said. Yes, he agreed, without any self-consciousness at all. She did laugh then. Just a small one. And he watched her with an expression she didn't know how to catalog. Something careful in it. Something that looked almost like surprise, as though he'd been in this kitchen 1,000 times and just now realized someone else was in it. They talked for 2 hours. It happened gradually, the way these things always do when neither person plans for them to. She told him about Boston, about the version of herself that had existed before Chicago. The girl who'd worked 3 jobs simultaneously and still managed to feel like the world was full of possibility rather than just full of tasks. He listened in a way she hadn't experienced from him before. Not politely, but actually, asking questions that connected to previous things she'd said, rather than just nodding and waiting for his turn. He told her, and this surprised her enough that she set her fork down, about his father. Not the version of the story she'd heard in fragments and understood was carefully curated, a different version. About being a 14-year-old boy who'd walked in on a meeting he wasn't supposed to see and had never quite been the same kind of child afterward. About inheriting an empire at 29 and spending the first 6 months certain he was going to make a mistake that couldn't be fixed. Were you afraid? She asked. He considered the question like it deserved real consideration. Not the way people expect. I wasn't afraid of the violence. I was afraid of the... He stopped, looked at the window, at the rain. The loneliness. Of being the one who makes the decisions. No one tells you that part. Charlotte looked at him across the table. For 3 years she had lived in this house and thought of Damien Calloway as a fact of her life, the way weather is a fact. Something to navigate around, neither good nor bad, simply present. She had been careful not to think too hard about who he was underneath the function he served in her arrangement, because that was the safest way to live inside it. But the man across the table from her was tired in a way she recognized. Tired underneath, in the places that don't go away with sleep. I understand that too, she said. He looked at her, and something shifted. Not dramatically, not with music or lightning, just shifted. The way a room shifts when someone opens a window and the air changes and you can't put it back the way it was. She washed the dishes. He dried them. Neither of them commented on the domestic absurdity of this, the mafia boss with a dish towel, because to comment on it would have broken something neither of them wanted broken. They ended up in the living room, which they had never occupied together in 3 years. He poured whiskey, asked if she wanted any, which he had never asked before. And she said yes, and they sat on opposite ends of the sofa with a reasonable amount of space between them and talked until after midnight. She told him about her mother, who had died 2 years before Charlotte left Boston and whose absence had made leaving feel like the only way forward rather than escape. He didn't say anything hollow about it. He said, "I'm sorry," once, and then he said nothing else, which was the right response and rarer than it should be. He told her that his youngest brother had stopped speaking to him 18 months ago, that the organization had cost him relationships he hadn't fully understood the value of until they were gone. "Do you regret it?" Charlotte asked. "The whole—" She gestured vaguely, and somehow he understood what she meant. "Regret is complicated," he said. "It assumes you had more choices than you actually did. I'm not sure I did." He turned the glass in his hand. "But I regret some of what it cost other people. Yes." She fell asleep on the sofa around 1 in the morning without meaning to, in the way you only fall asleep around someone when some part of you has decided, without consulting the rest of you, that you are safe. She woke up with a blanket over her that she hadn't put there. He was gone. His bedroom door was closed. The house was quiet and gray with early morning, and Charlotte sat up on the sofa with the blanket around her shoulders and felt, she tried to name it accurately, felt something that wasn't hope yet exactly, but was in the same direction. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the street below and told herself not to make too much of one evening. People have evenings. People share meals and conversations and fall asleep on couches. It doesn't always mean something, but she kept returning in the next few days to the way he'd said "I understand that too," and the way he'd looked when he said it. She kept returning to the dish towel, to the fennel. She started coming home earlier from the cafe. He started coming home earlier too. She couldn't be certain it was intentional. The first time could have been coincidence, the second time possibly. But by the fourth time she came home to find the kitchen lights already on, she allowed herself to stop pretending she didn't know what it meant. They didn't talk about any of it. That was its own kind of language. He asked about the cafe. She told him about the espresso machine, about the customer who came in every morning and ordered the same thing and never once varied. About the afternoon a pipe had burst in the back and she'd spent 4 hours with a plumber who kept calling her little lady. He listened. He remembered details from previous conversations and brought them back up, which is a rare and particular form of attention that Charlotte had not been on the receiving end of often enough. She asked him what his days actually looked like. Not the criminal architecture of it, which they both understood was off the table, but the human texture of it, what he ate for lunch, whether he drove himself or was driven, what happened to the hours between one meeting and the next. He drove himself, he said. He ate badly, usually, whatever was around. The hours between meetings he mostly spent on calls or reading documents he would have preferred not to read. "Do you have anything you do just for yourself?" she asked. He thought about it for a genuine moment. "I photograph things," he said, and then looked like he might regret having said it. "What things?" "Whatever." He paused. "I don't know. Interesting things. I'm not a photographer. It's just something I do." "Can I see?" "No," he said, but not meanly. She smiled and let it go. It had been 11 days since the rainy night in the kitchen. 11 days of earlier evenings and shared meals and conversations that went longer than they should. 11 days of a marriage becoming, quietly and without announcement, something neither of them had planned for it to become. Charlotte sat in the cafe on a Thursday afternoon, between the lunch rush and the after-work crowd, and let herself think the things she'd been carefully not thinking. That she was happy. Not the performed version she'd talked herself into during the harder years. Not the functional contentment of having built a life. Actually, genuinely, in her body happy. The kind where you catch yourself smiling at nothing while you're wiping down a counter. She'd been without that for a long time. She thought about Damien's face in the kitchen that first night. The way he'd looked at her when she laughed. The careful way he'd moved around her in the space, not crowding, not distant. The way a person moves around someone they're paying attention to. She thought, maybe this was always possible. Maybe it just needed the right kind of rain. She made a decision. His birthday was in 3 days, and she'd been ignoring that fact because they didn't do birthdays. It wasn't part of the arrangement, but the arrangement had shifted somewhere in the last 11 days, and Charlotte had decided, sitting in her cafe with afternoon light coming through the windows, that she was going to stop pretending she couldn't feel where they were heading. She was going to make him dinner, not here, at home. His mother's pasta, properly done, with the texture right and the fennel left out. She was going to show up to wherever he was, and she was going to let herself be his wife. Actually, for the first time. She didn't know yet that she was walking toward the thing that would rearrange her completely. She didn't know that the next time she saw him in a room full of his men, She would leave that room carrying something she'd never be fully able to put down. She just made a shopping list. She wrote it on the back of a receipt, the way she always did, the handwriting fast and a little crooked. Pasta. Cannellini beans. Good stock. Pancetta. No fennel. She folded it and put it in her pocket. Charlotte spent 2 days on the pasta. Not 2 full days. She had the cafe to run, orders to place, a part-time hire who kept showing up 7 minutes late and pretending not to notice that Charlotte noticed. But the pasta occupied the back of her mind the way important things do, the way decisions you've already made tend to settle into your body before your brain fully catches up with them. She found the recipe in 3 different places and cross-referenced them the way she used to cross-reference lease agreements and visa documents, looking for the version that felt most like something a woman in a Chicago kitchen in the 1970s would have made for her son. She called a specialty grocer on North Clark for the right kind of canned tomatoes. She bought pancetta from the Italian deli 3 blocks from the cafe and asked the man behind the counter, 60-something, suspicious of questions, whether it made a difference to render it slow or fast. He looked at her for a moment like she was being tested and then said, "Slow, always slow. What's the hurry?" She thought about that on the walk back. What's the hurry? She'd spent 3 years in a hurry inside this marriage, hurrying past the uncomfortable silences, past the moments that could have been something, past the version of herself that wanted more than the arrangement offered. She'd been efficient about it, practical. She'd built a life inside the constraints and told herself the constraints were fine, and then one rainy Wednesday had taken all of that apart without asking her permission. She made the pasta on Friday evening, took her time with it in a way she rarely took time with anything anymore. Rendered the pancetta slow, the way the man said. Used the good stock she'd found at the back of the cabinet. His, she realized, the kind you had to buy at a specialty store, which meant that somewhere inside Damien Calloway was a person who cared about stock, which felt important and slightly devastating. She tasted it at every stage. Adjusted, tasted again. When she got the texture right, which took longer than she expected and involved a judgment call about water starch that she wasn't certain about until she stood at the stove and felt something that was almost territorial. This is mine. I made this right. She put it in the best container she had, wrapped it carefully, and texted the number she had for his driver. Not Damien directly. They'd never texted directly. Another one of those arrangements that had stopped feeling normal recently, and asked where he was. The driver texted back. Club Morrow. Private event. Back entrance on Weller. She knew Club Morrow. She'd been there once early in the marriage for something that required her presence and her dress and her smile and very little else. It was the kind of place that didn't have a sign outside and didn't need one. She should have texted first. She knew that, standing in her kitchen with the container of pasta warm in her hands, wearing the gray dress she'd changed into because she'd wanted to, not because anyone would see her, she should have sent a message through the driver, said she'd made something, asked if he wanted her to leave it. She didn't. She took a car to Club Morrow and used the back entrance on Weller the way the driver had described. And she was maybe 40 feet inside the building, close enough to hear the voices from the main room, the low specific murmur of men talking in a place they considered private, when she heard her name. Or not her name. Her designation. She stopped because she recognized Damien's voice, and then she stopped more completely because of what came after it. "Boss has been coming home early." This was someone else. Younger, she thought. The kind of voice that performs casualness to hide that it's paying close attention. "Every night this week, from what I hear." A beat. Someone shifted. She heard ice move in a glass. "Domestic life agreeing with you, Mr. Calloway?" This one was older, rougher, the kind of voice that had been used to give orders for a long time. There was laughter. Not loud. The private, comfortable laughter of men who know each other well enough to say things sideways. She stood in the hallway and thought, clearly and precisely, I should leave right now. She didn't leave. "She cooked for him," the younger voice said. "My guy outside said she came in carrying food." More laughter. Then Damien's voice, and this was the part that Charlotte would spend the next weeks returning to against her will, the part that would sit in her chest like something swallowed wrong. "She's my wife on paper, nothing more. Easy. Not angry, not defensive. Easy. The way you say something that's obviously true. The way you'd say the sky is gray or it's cold in November. Unbothered by it. Slightly amused, maybe, at the idea that anyone would think otherwise. The laughter after it was warmer, more relaxed. The sound of men who'd been waiting to be reassured and had gotten what they wanted. Charlotte stood in the hallway for 4 more seconds. She counted them without meaning to, the way you count things when the rest of your brain has gone somewhere it can't be reached. Then she turned around. She walked back through the door she'd come in, the back entrance on Weller. She carried the container of pasta in both hands, still warm, and she walked down the block to the corner, and she stood there for a moment in the cold with the container and thought about exactly nothing for what felt like a long time and was probably 40 seconds. A cab went past. She didn't hail it. She started walking. By the time she got home, she had mapped out, with the calm efficiency of someone whose body has taken over the organizational functions while the rest of them catches up, everything she needed to do. She was not crying. She noticed this the way you notice the absence of something you expected, with faint, detached surprise. She put the pasta in the refrigerator. She went upstairs. She went to his bedroom, the first time in 3 years she had entered his bedroom without a specific logistical reason, and she began moving his things. It took 40 minutes. There wasn't as much as she'd expected. He was not a man who accumulated objects. She moved everything methodically, the suits he kept in the shared closet back to his room, the few personal items that had migrated over the past 11 days into the spaces between her things, a book, a charger, a jacket he'd left on the chair by the window that she'd moved twice and stopped moving because she'd started to like it there. She put the jacket on his bed. She went back to her own room and closed the door and sat on the edge of her bed in the gray dress she'd worn because she'd wanted to. She sat there for a while. Then she opened her laptop and booked a one-way flight to Montana. The cafe took longer to deal with, but she'd been thinking about the shape of this for longer than she'd admitted to herself. The way you sometimes see a decision coming from 3 weeks away and pretend you don't. She'd built something good. She knew that. The espresso machine she'd paid too much for, the mismatched frames, the particular quiet of closing time. She'd built all of it from nothing, and it had been hers in a way almost nothing else was. She sold it in 5 days to a woman who'd been asking about it for months, quietly, through a mutual contact, the way serious buyers do when they don't want to spook the seller. The number was fair. Charlotte didn't negotiate hard, which was unlike her, but she wasn't negotiating for the future she'd planned anymore, so the calculus was different. She told no one. She started packing in the evenings, slowly, things she knew she'd want and things she was surprised to find she wouldn't miss. Damien noticed something was wrong before she told him. He came home on a Tuesday, early, because that was the habit they'd built together, which she was now trying to stop thinking about as a thing they'd built together, and found the kitchen clean and cold and no sign she'd been home yet. And when she came in an hour later, she could see him recalibrate. He was good at reading rooms. She'd forgotten, during the soft weeks of early evenings and shared meals, how good he was at reading rooms. "You sold the cafe," he said. He said it the way people say things they already know, just needing the other person to confirm. She kept her coat on. "Yes." "When?" "Few days ago." He was standing at the kitchen counter. He'd been drinking water, the glass still in his hand, and he put it down carefully. "Why?" "Because I wanted to, Charlotte. That's my answer." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him do what he did, settle into himself, calibrate, decide how to approach. Usually she found this quality efficient and occasionally cold. Right now she found it unbearable, because she knew the calculation would be wrong no matter what he landed on. "Something happened," he said. "Did it?" "Don't do that." "I'm not doing anything." She put her bag down and went to the cabinet for a glass. Her movements were precise and deliberate, and she hated how visible that was. "I'm answering your questions." "You're not answering anything." "Damien." She filled the glass with water, drank some of it, turned around and looked at him directly for the first time since she'd come in. "I'm fine. I made a business decision. I'm planning some travel. There's nothing to discuss." He looked at her for a long moment. "Travel where?" "Montana." "For how long?" "I haven't decided." Another silence. The kitchen felt different from the kitchen it had been 3 weeks ago, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. "I don't understand what's happening," he said, and something in his voice shifted when he said it. Something that wasn't the careful public Damien, wasn't the boss, Was something underneath both of those that she didn't want to hear right now because she was 4 days from a flight and she could not afford to hear it right now? "There's nothing happening," she said. "We're having a conversation." "We're not. You're doing that thing where you're very calm and very precise and it means you're furious." She almost laughed. "You don't know me well enough to know what I do when I'm furious." "I know you better than you think." The sentence landed harder than it should have, and she saw from his face that he knew it had. He reached for it. She could see him reaching for the next sentence, the one that would make this go somewhere more manageable, and she cut him off. "I heard you at the club," she said. The kitchen went very still. He didn't move. That was the thing she noticed first, complete stillness, the kind that isn't absence of movement, but is its own kind of response. "Charlotte, you don't have to explain." She put the glass down. "There's nothing to explain. You were correct. We are exactly what you said we are. I just—" She stopped, picked it back up. "I needed a few days to remember that." "That's not—" He stopped himself, started again. "What you heard wasn't— I know what I heard. You heard me say something to men who I cannot show weakness to." His voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort in it. "You don't understand the context." "I understand perfectly." "You don't." He moved, not toward her, just shifted, like he needed to reorganize his body around what he was trying to say. "Those men look for any sign of— if I'd said anything else in that room, with those men, it would have been used. It gets used. Everything gets used." "I know." She said it quietly and meant it. "I know that's true. And I know you believe what you're saying right now. But it doesn't—" She looked at him across the kitchen, across the space that had been something else 3 weeks ago, and felt the words fail her for a moment before she found the plain ones. "It doesn't change what I heard. I was standing there. I heard how easy it was." He said nothing. "You weren't scared," she said. "You weren't protecting yourself. You were comfortable with it. Charlotte, I'm going to Montana. I'll let you know when I have a return date." She left the kitchen. He didn't follow her immediately, and she was almost upstairs when she heard him say her name again, quiet, from the hallway. She stopped on the stairs but didn't turn around. "I made a mistake," he said. She kept going. The week before the flight was one of the more disorienting experiences of Charlotte's recent life, and this was competing with some strong candidates. She finished packing. She tied up the remaining business details from the sale. She answered emails. She moved through the mansion like someone who was leaving it, which she was, and found that 3 years in a place creates a specific kind of attachment she hadn't fully anticipated, not to the place exactly, but to the version of herself that had lived there. She ran into Damien in the kitchen twice. Both times were navigated with a precision and mutual courtesy that she found more painful than a fight would have been. The third time was not precise. It was the Thursday before her Saturday flight, 9 in the evening, and she came downstairs for water and found him at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and nothing else. No phone, no documents, no pretense of doing anything, just sitting. He looked up when she came in. She got her water. She was going to leave. She made it to the doorway before he said, "I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life. I know that. I don't have any illusions about the kind of person I've been." She stopped. Didn't turn around yet. "But I need you to know that what happened between us the last few weeks, that wasn't—" He stopped. She could hear him figuring out what came next, which was unusual. "I was not normally a man who had trouble with words. I didn't perform any of that. I wasn't managing you. I don't have a clean way to say this." She turned around. He looked, she thought, genuinely exhausted. Not the public exhaustion of a man performing difficulty, but the real kind, the under-the-eyes kind, the kind you get when you've been losing sleep over something that won't resolve. "Then say it without clean," she said. He looked at his glass. "I've been doing this, all of this, the organization, the role, the whole thing, since I was 29 years old. And the one principle that has kept me alive longer than anything else is that you do not let people see what matters to you. Because the moment they see it, they own part of you. And in my world, that gets people hurt." Charlotte leaned against the doorframe. "You mattered to me," he said, "and I panicked. And I said the worst possible thing because it was the most efficient way to make it look like you didn't." The kitchen was very quiet. "Damien," she said finally, "I know it doesn't fix it." I was standing 40 feet away carrying dinner I'd spent 2 days making, she said, and her voice came out flatter than she intended, which was its own kind of honesty. I wasn't some abstract threat to your authority. I was your wife, bringing you food she'd made from scratch because She stopped. Because something had changed and I was responding to it. I know. And you laughed. He flinched, just barely, but she saw it. You laughed, she said again, because it seemed important that it be said twice. Not a nervous laugh, not a deflection, an easy laugh. Like the idea of me mattering to you was funny. He didn't defend it. She'd expected him to find an angle on it, and he didn't, which was somehow worse. I know, he said again, quietly. She stood in the doorway for another moment. She looked at him, at the man who had dried dishes with a dish towel and told her things about his father. She suspected he'd told very few people, and who had, 40 feet away with 12 of his men, unmade all of it with a single sentence delivered easily, comfortably, without apparent cost. I'll let you know when I have a return date, she said. She went back upstairs. She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark and went over the conversation the way you go over something when you're trying to find the part where it could have gone differently and keep arriving at the same place. The part where it was already done before it started. The part where the ending was in the beginning and she just hadn't been able to read it. She thought about the shopping list. Pasta, cannellini beans, good stock, pancetta, no fennel. Written on the back of a receipt, folded in her pocket. She thought about what it means to go towards something with your whole self and find the door already closed when you get there. How it's different from not going at all. How it is specifically and precisely worse. She was up before dawn. She was packed. She had 2 bags, which seemed like the right amount for a person starting over. Not so little it looked like a gesture, and not so much. It looked like she was sure she was never coming back. She was not sure she was never coming back. She was not sure of much beyond the next 48 hours, and she had decided that was enough to work with. She carried the bags to the front hall. Damien was there. She hadn't heard him come downstairs. I was dressed, not in the public way, just jeans and a shirt, and he was standing near the front door with something in his hand. An envelope, she saw, sealed. I'm not going to ask you to stay, he said. Good. I just want you to take this. He held it out. Not now. On the plane. She looked at the envelope. She looked at him. There were 100 things she could have said. She was aware of all of them, lined up somewhere, available. She didn't reach for any of them. She took the envelope. She picked up her bags. She opened the front door. The cab she'd called was at the curb. The morning was gray and cold in the specific way Chicago mornings are in that season, and her breath showed in the air, and she walked down the front steps and across the sidewalk and got into the cab without looking back. She put the envelope in her coat pocket. She did not open it. The cab pulled away from the curb, and she watched the mansion through the back window until it was gone. And then she watched the city instead, Chicago at 6 in the morning, its bones showing in the early light, the lake somewhere to the right of them gray and cold and enormous. She had spent 3 years in this city. She had built something here and then sold it. She had come closer to a version of her life she actually wanted than she'd been in years. And she had watched it come apart in a hallway while she stood 40 feet away with food she'd made from scratch. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it expecting the airline or the friend in Montana who was expecting her or anything else. It was a news alert. She read it twice before it processed. Mafia boss Damien Calloway accused of domestic abuse. Sources claim wife planning emergency escape. There was a photo. It was from 2 weeks ago, from a charity event they'd attended near the start of the arrangement, one of the last public appearances before the distance between them had become mutual and self-reinforcing. She was looking away from the camera. He was looking at her. The photo, cropped to show only that, looked like something it wasn't. Charlotte sat in the cab with Chicago moving past her on both sides and read the headline again. She thought, someone took a photograph and built a story around it. She thought, someone wanted this story to exist. And then she thought, with absolute cold clarity, the thought that would change every plan she'd made in the past 2 weeks. That the story had her name in it too. The cab driver had the radio on low, some morning talk show where 2 people were laughing about something Charlotte couldn't track, and she sat in the back seat with her phone in both hands and read the headline a 3rd time, The way you read things when your brain keeps refusing to absorb them. Mafia boss. Damian Calloway accused of domestic abuse. Sources claim wife planning emergency escape. The photo was from the Hargrove Foundation dinner 14 months ago. She remembered the dress she'd worn, navy, borrowed from a stylist the organization kept on retainer for exactly these events. She remembered standing at the edge of a conversation she wasn't part of, looking toward the exit, which was where she was looking in the photo. She remembered the food had been terrible and the speeches longer. She did not remember being photographed. She did not remember Damien looking at her the way he was looking at her in the photo. Focused, intent, something in his face she couldn't read from this angle and this distance and this particular framing, which was the point. She understood now. The framing was the entire point. Her phone rang. It was his number. The direct one. Not the driver, not the lawyer. His. She hadn't used it in 3 years, and the fact that it was lighting up her screen right now meant he'd seen the story already, which meant someone had sent it to him, which meant it had been out long enough to circulate. She answered. "I just saw it," she said. "Where are you?" His voice was clipped, compressed. The public voice, fully assembled. "Still in the cab, 10 minutes from the airport." "Don't go to the airport." "Damien, Charlotte." And there it was. Not the boss voice, something underneath it, tighter. "Please don't go to the airport right now. Come back to the house." She looked out the window at the city moving past. She thought about the envelope in her coat pocket. She thought about the ticket on her phone, the friend in Montana who was expecting her by afternoon, the 2 bags in the trunk that represented every decision she'd made in the past 2 weeks. "What happens if I go to the airport?" she asked. A pause. Short, but she'd learned enough about his pauses to know this one meant he was deciding how much to say. "The story has sources," he said. "Named sources. Someone built this deliberately, and they built it fast, which means they had the materials ready. If you board a flight to Montana today, it looks like flight. It confirms the narrative." "I am leaving," she said. "That's not a narrative. That's a fact." "I know." His voice dropped slightly. "I know that. But right now the story says you're leaving because I hurt you. And if you land in Montana and someone's waiting at the arrivals gate with a camera, who would be waiting?" Another pause. "Damien, who would be waiting?" "I don't know yet who built this," he said. "I'm working on that. But whoever did has resources, and they've been planning it. And right now your name is in this story the same way mine is. Your reputation, your face." He stopped. "I'm asking you to come back to the house until we understand what we're dealing with." Charlotte pressed her thumb against the edge of her phone case, hard, a focal point. "I'm not doing this for you," she said. "I know. I'm coming back because my name is in that story, and I won't be used in someone else's attack." "I understand. And when this is resolved, I'm getting on a plane." "Okay." She told the driver to turn around. The house felt different when she walked back into it. She'd left it 40 minutes ago with her bags and her envelope, and the specific cold clarity of a decision made. Now she came back through the front door and put her bags in the hallway and stood in the front room while Damien's head of security, a compact man named Rourke, who had the energy of someone who hadn't slept but was performing wakefulness convincingly, walked her through what they knew. Which wasn't much. Not yet. The story had gone up at 5:42 in the morning on a mid-tier crime blog that had, in the past hour, been picked up by 2 larger outlets. The named source was listed as a close associate of the Calloway organization. The photograph had been taken at the Hargrove Foundation dinner and submitted to the blog along with a statement that described in specific and fabricated detail a pattern of coercive control and intimidation. Charlotte sat in the front room and listened to Rourke talk and felt a particular kind of rage that she recognized from a long time ago. The kind that's cold rather than hot. The kind that doesn't shake your hands but makes them very still. "The statement uses my name," she said when Rourke paused. "Yes, ma'am. It quotes me. A version of you attributed to an anonymous close friend of Mrs. Calloway." "I don't have close friends in Chicago," she said. "I have customers and acquaintances. Whoever wrote that statement knows that, which is why they used close friend instead of naming someone." Rourke looked at her with the specific expression of a man recalibrating his assessment of a person. "That's correct. So the source isn't someone who knows me. There's someone who knows enough about me to know they can't fake a specific friend. That's one reading." What's another reading? Rourke glanced at Damien, who was standing near the window with his arms crossed, and an expression Charlotte had never seen on him before. Not quite anger, not quite fear, something that lived between the two. The other reading, Damien said, is that someone inside the organization built this. Someone who knows both of us well enough to know the photograph would work, and that you don't have an obvious social circle to contradict the framing. The room was quiet for a moment. Someone in your organization did this, Charlotte said. Possibly. To what end? He turned from the window. Destabilize my leadership. If I'm publicly accused of domestic abuse, the legitimate business interests I've been cultivating start pulling back. The city council relationships, the property portfolios. The people who have been willing to do business with me because I've built a credible surface. That surface cracks. He paused. And if my wife leaves me publicly under those circumstances, the optics become a liability, Charlotte said. Yes. She thought about the men at the club, the easy laughter. She's my wife on paper, nothing more. She thought about how, in the context of what was now sitting on her phone screen, that sentence had acquired a new and more complicated shape, because it turned out that she was not nothing to this situation. She was, in fact, quite central to it, just not in any way she had chosen. Who knew I was leaving? She said. Both men looked at her. Someone knew I'd booked a flight. The timing, story goes up at 5:42. My flight was at 8:15. That's not coincidence. Someone knew I'd be in a cab this morning with luggage. Rourke's expression changed. Damien went still in the way he'd gone still in the kitchen 2 nights ago, but this was a different kind of stillness. Operational. Get me the security footage from the front of the house, he said to Rourke. 48 hours. Rourke left the room. Charlotte and Damien were alone. She expected him to say something. He didn't, immediately. He moved to the chair across from where she was sitting and sat down, which she noticed because he almost never sat in that chair. It was one of those pieces of furniture in the house that existed for display rather than use. He sat in it like a person who was tired enough to use furniture for what it was made for. I need to tell you something, he said. His tone was different. Not the managed version, not the calibrated version. Something beneath both of those, and she recognized it from the kitchen 3 weeks ago and from 2 nights ago in the quiet of the conversation that hadn't fixed anything but had been real. Then tell me, she said. The man at the club. Marco Vitelli. The older voice. The one who started the... He stopped. He's been with the organization for 22 years. He was my father's man before he was mine, and he has never accepted the transition the way the others have. Charlotte waited. He's been managing the West Side operations for 8 years. He controls a significant portion of the cash flow. And 6 weeks ago I told him I was restructuring that arrangement, pulling 2 of his territories and redistributing them. He didn't take that well. He was careful about how he showed it, but no. And you think, I think Marco Vitelli has been waiting for a lever, Damien said. And I think he found it when he found out I was coming home early every night. Charlotte heard that and felt something cold move through her that wasn't entirely about Vitelli. He was watching the house, she said. Someone was. So the night at the club, possibly staged, he said. Possibly he arranged for the conversation to happen where it happened. He knows the layout of Morrow. He knows which hallways carry sound. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm not certain, but the timing is right and the construction of the story is right. It's someone who knows enough to be dangerous and not enough to be accurate. Charlotte sat with this for a moment. She sat with the full weight of it. The possibility that the moment she'd been standing in that hallway carrying her pasta had been arranged. That the sentence she'd been carrying in her chest for 2 weeks might have been delivered specifically for her to hear. He wanted me to leave, she said. He wanted you to leave publicly, under circumstances that looked like escape, she said. Yes. She stood up. She didn't have a destination in mind. She just needed to stand. She walked to the window Damien had been standing at and looked out at the street. The same street she'd left on 40 minutes ago. The same gray morning. The same city that had been hers for 3 years and was now the setting for something she hadn't agreed to be part of. He heard you say it, she said. At the club. Yes. And he knew I heard it too, or suspected. He's been in this business long enough to know how to read a room. If I had to guess, yes. He knew. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window. He used your worst moment to build his case. Yes. And mine. Yes. She stayed at the window for a while. She was doing the math, not the emotional math, which she'd been doing and redoing for 2 weeks and was tired of, but the practical math. The shape of what she'd walked back into, what it required, what the options actually were. The story is going to spread, and she said, it already is. If I leave, if I get on any plane in the next week, it confirms it. Yes. And if I stay and we issue some kind of denial, it looks managed, controlled, which also confirms it. Damien said nothing. So the only thing that doesn't confirm it, she said slowly, is appearing together, publicly, normally, like none of this is happening. That would be the effective counter, he said carefully. She turned around. He was watching her with an expression she didn't know how to read, which was unusual. She'd gotten better at reading him. This one was new. You're not going to ask me to do that, she said. No. But you're telling me it's the option. I'm telling you what I know. What you do with it is your decision. She studied him. He looked like a man who had made peace with losing something, but not fully. Like someone who set down a heavy thing and still feels the weight of it in their arms. 2 weeks, she said. What? If I do this, 2 weeks. Enough appearances to make the story collapse under its own weight, and then I get on a plane. Something moved across his face. She couldn't name it entirely. Okay. I'm not doing it for you, she said, for the second time that morning. I know. I'm doing it because my name is in that story, and I won't let Marco Vitelli write the ending of my marriage. I understand. And when the 2 weeks are done, you get on a plane, he said. I won't ask for anything else. She believed him. She wasn't sure why. After everything, she still believed him when he said things in that particular register, the one without management in it, without calculation. But she did, and she'd stopped trying to talk herself out of trusting her own reading of people. I need a room that isn't our bedroom, she said. A separate space. I'm not performing this in private. The guest suite on the 3rd floor. Fine. She picked up her coat from the chair she'd draped it over. And I need to know everything about what happened at Morrow. Every detail you have. If I'm walking into public appearances with you, I need to understand the full landscape. I'll brief you this afternoon. Not Rourke. You. He nodded. The 2 weeks that followed were unlike anything Charlotte had experienced in 3 years of an unusual life. The first event was a charity gala 4 days after she'd come back through the front door with her bags. She wore a dress she'd chosen herself, deep green, structured, and she did her own hair because she found the process of doing it calming, each pin placed where she meant to place it. Damien knocked on the guest suite door at 7. When she opened it, he looked at her for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "You look. Let's go," she said. The gala was held in a hotel ballroom that Charlotte had been to before, under different circumstances, and she understood within the first 10 minutes what the next 2 weeks were going to require. Not just presence, not just the performance of normalcy. The story was already in the room. She could see it in the way people looked at them when they walked in together, the fractional pause in conversations, the specific quality of attention that people pay to a situation they've already heard a version of. She took Damien's arm, not because the gesture was required, because she made a decision, standing at the entrance of a room full of people who'd already written a story about her, that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it completely. She felt him look at her. She didn't look back. They moved through the room and she introduced herself to people she'd never met, engaged in conversations about charitable initiatives and city development and the renovation of the waterfront. And she was good at it in a way she'd never had occasion to be before. Good at the genuine version, not the performed version. She asked questions because she was actually curious, and people responded to that in the way people always respond to being genuinely asked about themselves. At one point, near the end of the first hour, Damien introduced her to a city alderman as "my wife Charlotte," and the 2 additional words, "my wife," arrived differently than they ever had in 3 years of hearing them. Not because he'd added anything, because of how he said it, like it meant something. She kept her face even. She shook the alderman's hand. Later, in the car going home, they sat in silence for several minutes. "You were good tonight," he said. "I know," she said. The silence resumed. It was different from the kitchen silences they'd developed over the good weeks. This one had more in it, more unsaid, more of the shape of things neither of them was going to address tonight. Vitelli was there, Damien said. She looked over. I know, I saw him. You didn't react. I had no reason to react. He doesn't know what I know. Damien looked at her. You identified him yourself. Gray-haired 60s, southwest corner, watching the entrance all evening, she said. He wasn't subtle. Another silence. Charlotte, he said. Don't, she said. Not tonight. We had a good night in a tactical sense, and I'd like to just let that be what it was. He stopped. She watched the city out the window. She was tired in the specific way of someone who has been performing presence for 4 hours, and underneath the tiredness, she was aware of something more complicated, something she didn't want to look at directly yet. The problem was that it hadn't felt entirely like performance. Not all of it. There had been moments, specific, small moments, the kind that don't announce themselves, where she'd looked across a room and found him already looking at her, and the look had been the kind that means something, and she had kept moving, kept talking, kept her professional mask perfectly in place, and had not dealt with what the look meant, and was not going to deal with it tonight. She was going to Montana in 10 days. That was the fact she was going to hold on to. The following days accumulated the way the good weeks had, not with the soft warmth of those weeks, but with their own kind of density. Business dinners where she sat beside him and held her own in conversations about real estate development and city contracts. A magazine interview where she sat across from a journalist who was clearly hoping for cracks and found none, because Charlotte had been managing difficult conversations since she was 19 years old, and this was simply a new context for an old skill. There was an afternoon, the 5th day, where he took her to a gallery opening on the north side. It wasn't a requirement. There was no press there, no organizational necessity. She found out later that he'd agreed to attend because the artist was someone his mother had known, and he went every year, and this year he'd asked Charlotte if she wanted to come instead of going alone. She said yes because she'd run out of reasons to say no to things that weren't actually dangerous. They walked through the gallery slowly. He knew things about the work that surprised her. Not art world knowledge, but personal knowledge, the kind you get from paying attention over time. He told her about one piece, a large abstract in blues and grays, that the artist had made the winter his wife died. He told her about it quietly, standing beside her, his voice at the register he used when he wasn't performing anything. She looked at the painting. She could see the grief in it, now that she knew to look. She hadn't before. How do you know all this? She asked. I asked him once, years ago. What made you ask? He was quiet for a moment. It looked like something felt instead of made. I wanted to know what the feeling was. She stood beside him and looked at the painting for a while longer than she'd planned to. The problem with the 2 weeks was that they were working, not just tactically. She could see the story losing air in real time. The follow-up articles were thinner. The tone had shifted from accusation to speculation, and 2 of the original outlets had quietly softened their framing. Marco Vitelli's gambit was collapsing because the evidence it depended on, an absent wife, a household in crisis, had failed to materialize. But the other thing was also happening. The thing she'd told herself wasn't happening. On the 8th day, they came home from a dinner, and she was taking off her earrings in the guest suite when she heard him stop outside the closed door. She heard him stand there for a moment. She heard him not knock. She heard him go down the hallway to his own room. She sat at the vanity with one earring off and one earring on, and looked at her own face in the mirror for a long time. She had 4 days left. The gala on the 9th night was the largest event. 400 people, 2 journalists from outlets that actually mattered. A room where the story's final shape would be decided. She knew this going in. Damien had briefed her on every detail, and she'd listened and asked questions, and they'd sat across from each other at the kitchen table and planned the evening with the precision of people who had discovered, belatedly, that they were good at working together. 3 hours into the event, she was standing near the bar talking to a woman from the city's Historic Preservation Board when she heard the voice. Marco Vitelli, 8 feet to her left, talking to 2 men she didn't recognize. Remarkable resilience, he was saying, for a woman in her position. The words were benign, the tone was not. She kept her eyes on the woman from the preservation board and kept talking about limestone facades, and she felt her heart rate do something specific and deliberate, and she controlled it with the same precision she'd been using for 9 days. Then she looked over at Vitelli directly. He met her eyes. And she saw it, just for a moment, just a flash before his expression resettled into its practiced neutral. She saw that he was reassessing, that something in her direct gaze had landed in a way he hadn't anticipated from the woman he'd tried to erase with a photograph and a fabricated statement. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned back to the woman from the preservation board and said, "The limestone on the merchant building is extraordinary. Have you managed to get access inside?" Later, when the evening was winding down, she found Damien. "We need to talk about Vitelli," she said. "Not tonight, but soon." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've been watching him for 9 days and I have observations," she said. "And I think there's a way to use the next 4 days that's more effective than what we've been doing." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not just running out the clock." "I never was," she said. "I was angry. I'm still angry. But this is my name in this story too, and if I'm going to spend 2 weeks helping fix it, I'm going to fix it properly." He studied her face with the careful attention she'd come to recognize as his version of trying to understand something he hadn't expected. "Okay," he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Breakfast. All of it on the table." All of it. No management, no calibration. What you actually know about Vitelli and what you think he's going to do next, and what it would take to make sure that whatever he does next, I'm not in the blast radius. She watched his expression and saw the moment. He understood that the woman standing in front of him had spent 9 days in his world and had been paying attention the whole time, and that the 2 weeks he'd agreed to as a concession had produced something he hadn't anticipated. She had become a problem for Marco Vitelli not by leaving, but by staying. She didn't say any of that. She picked up her glass and turned back toward the room. She had 3 days left. She wasn't sure anymore what she was going to do with them. The breakfast was at 7. Charlotte was already at the kitchen table when Damien came downstairs, which she could tell surprised him. Not the being there part, but the being there first part, with a legal pad and a pen and the coffee already made, 2 cups, like she'd been up for a while, which she had. She hadn't slept past 4. She'd spent the early hours doing what she did when something required clarity. She wrote things down. Not feelings, facts. The shape of what she knew, what she'd observed, what didn't fit. By 6, she had 3 pages of notes in her fast, slightly crooked handwriting, and by 6:30 she had a theory she didn't entirely like. He sat down across from her, poured coffee, looked at the legal pad. "You've been up a while," he said. "Tell me about Vitelli's territories," she said. "The 2 you pulled. What exactly was happening in them?" He studied her for a moment. Then he drank his coffee and started talking. It took 40 minutes. He was thorough in the way she'd come to understand was characteristic of him, not offering more than was asked, but answering completely what was. The West Side territories generated significant cash flow through 3 legitimate-facing businesses and a network of arrangements she didn't need the full details of and didn't ask for. Pulling them from Vitelli's control wasn't symbolic, it was structural. It reduced his operational capacity by roughly 40%. "And his response when you told him," she said, "controlled." He said he understood. He asked about the timeline. He didn't push back. "No." "That didn't concern you?" Damien was quiet for a moment. In retrospect, a man who's run those territories for 8 years, who built the structures in them, who has his people embedded throughout, he hears he's losing 40% of his operation, and he says he understands and asks about the timeline. She looked at him across the table. He was already planning. "Yes." "How long before you told him about the restructure did the shifts start between us?" she asked. "The evenings, the dinners." He thought about it. "The rainy Wednesday was 4 days after I told him." She sat with that. "So Vitelli watched you start coming home early," she said. "Watched the pattern change. And within 2 weeks he had a photograph, a fabricated statement, and a media contact ready to publish. He's efficient." "He's been building this longer than 2 weeks," she said. "The photograph is 14 months old. He's been holding it, waiting for the right circumstance." Damien looked at her steadily. "He needed a reason for me to leave that looked real," she said. "A real departure. Not a business trip, not a scheduled absence, something that looked like flight, like I was getting out." She tapped the legal pad with her pen. "He manufactured the reason. The night at the club. He staged the conversation." "I've been thinking the same thing. Did you look at the security footage from Morrow?" Yes. He arrived early, positioned himself specifically. Damien's jaw tightened, just briefly. He knew where the sound carried. So the sentence was a weapon, she said flatly. He needed you to say something that would send me to the airport. He engineered the situation to make sure you'd say exactly the right thing. She looked at him. He knows you well enough to know what you'd say in that room with those men. Damien said nothing. He's known you since you were a child, she said. Yes. He knows every reflex you have. Yes. He used your worst instinct against both of us, she said, and it almost worked. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Chicago was doing its morning thing. Traffic building, a distant siren, the radiator in the wall ticking as the heat came up. What are you thinking? He asked. I'm thinking that Vitelli made two mistakes, she said. The first is that he assumed I'd stay gone, that once I was on a plane to Montana, his problem was solved. She looked at her notes. The second is that he underestimated what 12 days of public appearances does to a story. It's not enough to deny an accusation. You have to make the accusation look structurally absurd. And we've done that, but not completely. Not yet. What would complete it? She looked up from the legal pad. What's the one thing that would make it impossible for him to use my name again? In any future move? He thought about it. She could see him think. The stillness, the particular internal quality of someone who is actually working through something rather than performing consideration. If you were publicly, unambiguously, your own person in this story, he said slowly. Not a victim, not a prop, an active participant. Someone who chose to be here, she said. Someone who spoke. You want to do the Meridian interview. She'd heard about the Meridian interview 3 days ago. A journalist named Sasha Crane, known for profiles that did not go easy on their subjects, had been requesting access for 2 weeks. Damien had declined twice. I want to do the Meridian interview, Charlotte said. Alone, without you in the room. Something crossed his face. Charlotte, I don't need management, she said. I've been managing conversations since before I could legally drink, and I need Sasha Crane to walk away from that interview with nothing she can use against either of us, which means I need to be the one in the room, not a spokesperson, and not you. Crane is... she's not soft. Neither am I. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? I meant... He stopped, started again. If something goes wrong in that interview, if she has information we don't know she has, if Vitelli has reached her, then I'll handle it, Charlotte said. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you what I'm going to do with the next 3 days. The silence stretched. Okay, he said. And then I need something from you, she said. Something public. He waited. Whatever you're planning to do about Vitelli, and I know you're planning something, I've watched you on the phone for the past 4 days, whatever that looks like, it needs to happen in a way that has nothing to do with me. I won't be used as justification for anything that comes next on your end. Are we clear? Clear. My name was put in this story without my consent, she said. My name comes out of it the same way. She closed the legal pad. The Meridian interview was arranged for the following afternoon. Sasha Crane arrived at the hotel suite they'd booked for the meeting. Neutral ground, Charlotte's choice, at 2 o'clock. She was younger than Charlotte had expected, late 30s, with the particular energy of someone who has learned to make her stillness look like patience when it was actually attention. She had a recorder and a notebook and a pen, and she set all three on the table between them without asking if it was okay. Charlotte let her. Thank you for meeting with me, Crane said. Of course, Charlotte said. Your husband declined twice. I know. But you said yes. I did. Crane looked at her. Why? Because I have things I'd like to say, Charlotte said. And because I think you're good at your job, which means the story you write will be the story of this conversation rather than the story someone else handed you. Crane's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. You've read my work. Several pieces. The Harrington profile was particularly good, the part about the second wife. Most people don't get that far in. I read things thoroughly. Crane picked up her pen. Tell me about the allegations. They're false, Charlotte said. Specifically, comprehensively, and I believe deliberately. I won't speculate on who originated them because I don't have documented evidence, and I'm not interested in making accusations I can't support. What I can tell you is that I have been in this city for 3 years, I have run a business, I have had a life, and the portrait in that article bears no resemblance to any version of my experience. The photograph is real. The interpretation applied to it is fabricated. You look like you were trying to leave the room. I was looking toward a window, Charlotte said. The speeches had been going for 40 minutes and the room was warm. I look toward windows when I'm warm. This is not a pattern of behavior that requires a clinical explanation. Something at the corner of Crane's mouth. Not quite a smile. The source described specific incidents, Crane said. I know what the source described. And I'd like you to think carefully about what it means that the source described incidents without dates, without witnesses, without locations, Charlotte said. In my experience, and I've read enough of your work to know this is true of yours as well, specific claims have specific details. What that source gave you was the shape of something without the substance. Crane looked at her recorder, then back at Charlotte. You're not denying that your marriage has been difficult. I'm not denying anything about my marriage that's true, Charlotte said. Marriages are complicated. That's not news, and I won't pretend otherwise. But complicated isn't the same as dangerous, and in the rush to make this story interesting, someone blurred that line deliberately. Why would someone do that? I said I won't speculate on things I can't document. Then tell me what you can document. Charlotte leaned forward slightly. I can document that I'm sitting here in this room because I chose to be, not because anyone told me to, not because I was managed or handled or positioned. I have a legal pad in my bag with 3 pages of notes I wrote at 5 this morning because I don't sleep well, and I think better when I write things down. I am here because my name was put in a story without my consent, and I intend to take it back. Crane was quiet for a moment. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Honestly, a spokesperson with a prepared statement and a very expensive publicist waiting outside. My husband offered, Charlotte said. I said no. Why? Because I can speak for myself, Charlotte said. I always could. That's the part of this story that no one seems to have accounted for. The interview ran 90 minutes. Crane asked hard questions, and Charlotte answered the ones she could and redirected the ones she couldn't in ways that she knew Crane recognized as intentional, which was its own kind of signal. I know what you're doing, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, which is more respect than a denial would be. When it was over, Crane packed up her recorder and notebook with the deliberateness of someone whose mind was already somewhere else. Off the record, she said. Charlotte waited. The source who brought me this story has brought me things before, Crane said. 2 of them didn't check out. I almost didn't run this one. Why did you? The photograph was compelling. Photographs always are, Charlotte said. Crane picked up her bag. I'll be in touch before it publishes. I appreciate that. After she left, Charlotte sat alone in the hotel suite for a while. She ordered tea she didn't particularly want and drank half of it and sat by the window and looked at Chicago from 12 floors up. The lake was visible from here, so gray and enormous, exactly as it always was. She'd never stopped finding it slightly startling, the size of it. You grew up in Boston, you knew water, but this was a different scale entirely. Her phone buzzed. Damien, how did it go? She typed back. Fine. Crane's going to write a fair piece. A pause. Then, how do you know? She typed, because I gave her something better than what she came in with. Another pause. Longer. Damien, I need you at the house tonight. Something's happened. She stared at the message. She typed, what kind of something? His response came back in under 10 seconds, which told her everything about the urgency before she read the words. Damien, Vitelli moved. Tonight. Be here by 8. She was there by 7:40. Rourke met her at the door, which was unusual. Rourke didn't do door duty. His face had the specific compression of someone holding themselves very steady around something that wanted to move. Where is he? She said. Study. 2nd floor. She took the stairs. The study was a room she'd been in twice in 3 years. It was Damien's operational space, the place where the work that wasn't supposed to exist got done. She pushed the door open and found him standing at the desk with 3 men she recognized from the past 12 days of public appearances, and 2 she didn't. The desk had papers on it and a laptop open, and a phone face-up that had clearly been the center of something recently. He looked up when she came in. Close the door, he said. She closed it. Vitelli called a meeting, he said. This afternoon. Without my authorization. Senior captains, West Side, 7 men. What kind of meeting? The kind where you put a motion on the table. He held her gaze. He's calling for a leadership review. She understood the shape of that without needing it explained. In the architecture of organizations like this one, a leadership review called by a senior figure with sufficient support was a formal challenge. It had rules, history, weight. It wasn't a complaint. It was a mechanism. He has the numbers? She asked. He has 4 confirmed. He needs 5 for the review to proceed. How many total in the senior council? 11. So he needs 1 more. Yes. And he's working on it. As of 2 hours ago? Yes. She stood in the doorway of the study and felt the room recalibrate around her. The 2 men she didn't know were looking at her with the particular caution of people who hadn't decided yet what category to put her in. The media story was the opening move, she said. He was trying to establish a public narrative of incompetence. A boss who abuses his wife, who's lost control of his household, is a boss who's lost control of everything, Damien said. Yes. So when the story didn't land the way he planned, he accelerated. Damien came around from behind the desk. I was in his shirt sleeves, collar open, and he looked like a man who had been working for several hours without interruption. He can't wait anymore. If we successfully rebut the media story, he loses the narrative. So he's moving now, before the Crane piece publishes. When does he need the 5th vote? He has until midnight Saturday to formally file the review. That's 31 hours. She did the math. Saturday midnight. It was Friday evening. What are you going to do? She asked. The room was very quiet. Damien looked at her for a moment, and she saw him make a decision, saw the precise moment he stopped calculating what to share and shared it. I need to get to Caruso before Vitelli does, he said. Anton Caruso. He's the swing vote. He's been with the organization for 6 years. He's methodical. He doesn't make decisions based on loyalty. He makes them based on what he calculates will produce stability. So he's not Vitelli's, she said, but he's not yours either. Not yet. What does he need to see to calculate stability? A functioning leadership, he said. Unified, credible, not embattled. She understood before he finished the sentence. He needs to see us. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. She walked further into the room. The 2 unfamiliar men shifted slightly. Caruso has been watching the last 12 days. Yes. He's seen the public appearances. The gala. The dinner. The gallery. Yes. But he's an insider. He knows the difference between a public performance and an actual household. He does. So a public appearance isn't enough for him. Damien said nothing. What's enough for him? She said. Charlotte. What's enough for him, Damien? He exhaled slowly. There's an informal dinner tomorrow night, private. 6 people, Caruso and his wife, 2 other council members I trust, and us. It was scheduled before any of this. I'd been planning to cancel it. Don't cancel it. The room shifted again. You understand what you're saying, he said. I understand perfectly. She held his gaze. At a public event, I'm a performance. At a private dinner with the man whose vote decides the next 31 hours, I'm evidence. And I'm better evidence than anything else you have. He didn't deny it. I'm not asking you to do this, he said. I know you're not. I'm deciding. She looked around the room. The men, the papers on the desk, the laptop open to something she couldn't read from here. I have 2 days left on our agreement. I'll use them. The silence held. And after Saturday, she said, we're done. Whatever happens with Vitelli, whatever the review outcome, whatever comes next on your side, Mom, I'm on a plane Sunday morning. I know. We're clear. We're clear. She looked at him for one more moment, at the man in his shirt sleeves with the collar open and the exhaustion he wasn't quite hiding, and the expression she still couldn't fully name after all these weeks of looking at him. Then she walked out of the study and went upstairs. She did not sleep at all that night. She lay in the guest suite and ran through everything she knew, everything she'd observed, everything she'd built in the past 12 days, and she tried to separate what was useful from what was personal, and found that the line between them had become harder to locate than it had any right to be. She was angry at herself for that. It was a clean, focused anger, the kind that doesn't require much energy once you've found its shape. She had walked into this arrangement with specific terms. She had maintained those terms under circumstances that would have justified abandoning them. She had been efficient and clear, and she had done what needed doing without confusing it with something it wasn't. And yet at 4 in the morning, she was lying in a guest suite in a house she'd been about to leave for the second time, running calculations about a man whose worst moment she'd heard from 40 feet away, and feeling something she had not given herself permission to feel, which was that she did not entirely want to get on the plane Sunday. She acknowledged the feeling with the same precision she'd applied to the legal pad. Then she set it aside. There was a dinner to get through first. The dinner was at Damien's private dining room, a space she'd been in once for one of the early arrangement events and hadn't been back to since. 6 people, as he'd said. Caruso was a compact, precise man in his 50s with very clean hands and a wife who said little but heard everything, which Charlotte recognized as a specific kind of intelligence and adjusted accordingly. Charlotte wore the navy dress, not the gala dress, the original one, the same cut as the photo that had been used against her, which was a calculated choice she hadn't explained to anyone. She sat beside Damien. The dinner moved through its courses with the texture of these things. Conversation that wasn't the real conversation. Observations that weren't really about what they were ostensibly about. Charlotte contributed to the surface conversation and paid attention underneath it, which was a skill she'd been developing since she was a girl in Boston, managing difficult situations with the particular toolkit of someone who couldn't afford to be difficult herself. Midway through the second course, Caruso said, to the table generally, to no one specifically, "The coverage this week has been interesting." Charlotte put her fork down. "Journalism is a strange business," she said. "The best of it follows evidence. The rest follows narrative." Caruso looked at her. "I found," she continued, "that the quickest way to evaluate a story is to ask what it needs you to believe before you've read the first sentence. If the answer is something simple and absolute, be cautious." "And what did this week's stories need you to believe?" Caruso said. "That I had no agency," Charlotte said. "That I was a situation rather than a person." She picked up her fork again. "That particular framing tends to collapse when the person in question sits down to dinner and speaks in full sentences." Caruso looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Damien. Then he picked up his wine glass and said nothing for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to mean something. "Your wife has a precise mind," he said to Damien. "Yes," Damien said. He didn't say it like it was news. The dinner went 3 hours. When it was over and Caruso and his wife were leaving, Caruso shook Charlotte's hand at the door and said, quietly, while Damien was saying something to the other guests, "You came back." "I did," she said. "Most people in your position wouldn't have." "I'm not most people," she said, "and it was my name in the story." He nodded once. Something decided in his face. She went back inside. The hour between the guests leaving and midnight was the longest of the week. She sat in the front room. Damien was on the phone, then off it, then on it again. Rourke came and went. There was a quality to the house that she'd never felt in 3 years of living in it, a held-breath quality, like the building itself was waiting. At 11:47, Rourke appeared in the doorway of the front room. "Caruso filed," he said. "Opposition to review. He's a no." She looked at the clock. 11:47, 13 minutes before Vitelli's deadline. With Caruso opposing, Vitelli had 4 votes. He needed 5. He was 1 short and out of time. The review would not be filed. She heard Damien, somewhere in the house, say something she couldn't make out. The tone of it said everything. She sat in the front room with her hands in her lap. She should have felt the clean satisfaction of a completed task. She had the framework for it. The logic was sound. The outcome was the correct one, and she had contributed to it with precision and intention. What she felt instead was more complicated. It lived in the same chest where she'd been storing everything she hadn't looked at directly, and it was getting harder to store things there without consequence. Her phone said Saturday, 12:03 in the morning. 1 day left. Damien appeared in the doorway. He looked like a man who had just set down something extremely heavy, and unlike the other times she'd seen exhaustion in him, this time he didn't try to recalibrate around it. He just stood in the doorway and looked at her. "It's done," he said. "I know." He came into the room. He didn't sit down. He stood a few feet from where she was sitting, and she could see him working through whatever he'd decided to say, which was unusual enough that she waited. "What you did tonight," he said. "At dinner. The whole 2 weeks. I need you to know that I—" He stopped, looked at the floor, back at her. "I don't have a way to say this that doesn't sound like it's about what you did for me, and I need it to not be about that." "Then say the other part," she said. He sat down then, in the chair across from her, the one he'd sat in the morning she'd told him she'd heard everything. Same chair, different conversation. "I've been thinking about the gallery," he said. "The painting, the one I told you about." She hadn't expected that. "I told you it looked like something felt instead of made," he said. "And I told you I'd ask the artist what the feeling was." He was looking at his hands. "What I didn't tell you is that I've been going to that gallery for 7 years, every time he has a show. And for 6 of those years I went alone and I stood in front of that painting, and I understood it the way you understand something that matches something inside you." He looked up. "This year was the first time it felt different, because you were standing next to me." The room was quiet. Charlotte looked at him across the space between the chairs. "Damien," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I know you're getting on a plane tomorrow. I know what we agreed. I'm not asking you to change that." "Then what are you doing?" "Telling you the truth," he said, "without management, without calibration, the way you asked me to do." She didn't look away from him. She thought about what it cost him to say things this way. The man who'd spent his entire adult life treating vulnerability as a structural weakness, who'd been raised inside an organization that weaponized anything that looked like need. She thought about how the sentence in the hallway of Club Maro had been an artifact of that training, reflexive and devastating, and how nothing about what he was doing right now was reflexive. She thought about the painting, about standing beside him in the gallery and not knowing until she knew. "I'm still getting on the plane," she said. "I know." "Not because I want to run," she said. "Because I need to know whether what happened between us was real or whether it was a very convincing version of something real, and I can't know that from inside this house." He nodded. "I understand." "And because I need you to have enough time to understand it too," she said. "Not in a crisis. Not with Vitelli and review votes and media stories. When all of this is just quiet. When it's only the actual question." He was very still. "Give me 2 months," she said. He looked at her. "Not a deadline," she said. "Not a test. 2 months where I go to Montana and I come back to myself, and you," she looked at him steadily, "you figure out what this life actually needs to look like for a person to exist inside it. Not a function, a person." His jaw tightened slightly. Not against her. She could tell the difference now. Against whatever it cost him to stay still and hear this rather than reach for the next move. "And if at the end of 2 months," he said slowly, "you decide the answer is no, then the answer is no," she said, "and you respect it. And if the answer is yes," she held his gaze, "then we start over, completely, from nothing, no arrangement, no paper marriage, no management, just," she searched for the word, "just honest." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does at midnight, persistent and indifferent and enormous. "Okay," he said. She stood up. He stood up. They were closer than she'd planned when they were both standing, the furniture arrangement of the room having done something she hadn't accounted for, and she could see him very clearly from here. The tiredness and the open quality of his face and the particular stillness of a person who has made a decision and is holding it carefully. She reached out and put her hand against his jaw, briefly, the way you touch something you're memorizing. Then she stepped back. "Sunday morning," she said. "I'll drive you to the airport," he said. "I know you will," she said. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the guest suite bed and put her hands in her lap and breathed for a while in the specific way of someone who is managing the gap between what they feel and what they've decided to do about it, which are not always the same thing and don't have to be. She looked at her bags, still packed from the first time she'd tried to leave. She looked at the envelope in the pocket of her coat, still sealed, still unread, sitting there since the morning he'd handed it to her on the front steps. She reached for the coat. She took out the envelope. She held it for a moment, felt the weight of it, which was heavier than a single sheet of paper, which meant there was more than one page inside. She put her thumb under the seal. The envelope contained 4 pages. Charlotte sat on the edge of the guest suite bed with her coat still half across her lap and read them in the way she read things that mattered, slowly, without moving, with the specific quality of attention she usually reserved for documents that had consequences. The handwriting was his. She recognized it from the rare occasion she'd seen it on a note left on the counter. Small, dense, the kind of handwriting that has been deliberately compressed over years until it takes up as little space as possible on the page. Like the man himself, she thought, and then caught herself thinking it. He had not written a love letter. She understood, reading the first page, that this had been intentional. He was not a man who trusted the love letter form, its conventions, its permission to be imprecise, the way it allows the writer to perform feeling rather than locate it. What he had written instead was something closer to an accounting, a record. He wrote about the first time he had seen her in the kitchen making coffee. Not the rainy Wednesday, earlier than that. 3 weeks after the arrangement had begun. He had come downstairs at 6 in the morning because he rarely slept past 5:30 and found her standing at the counter with her back to the room, still in the clothes she'd worn the previous day, holding her cup with both hands like she was cold. He had stood in the doorway for almost a minute, he wrote, and then retreated upstairs without making coffee, because he didn't know what to do with the particular quality of her stillness, and understood that the correct response was to leave it alone. He wrote about watching her rebuild the cafe. He hadn't told her he'd been paying attention, but he had. The permit applications that came through the organization's property management contacts, the inspection reports, the slow accumulation of details that told the story of someone building something from the ground up with very little margin for error. He wrote, "I had people in 3 cities handling operations I've been running for years, and none of them had the focus you brought to 12 tables and an espresso machine. I noticed. I didn't know what to do with noticing." He wrote about the photographs. This was the 3rd page, and Charlotte slowed down further when she reached it. He had a camera, a real one, not a phone, a film camera his mother had given him when he was 17 because she believed, he wrote, that the only way to truly see something was to commit to it before you knew how it would develop. He had been using it for years, mostly architecture, occasionally light. He had started photographing Charlotte without planning to. The first time was at a function. Early in the arrangement, one of those events she'd attended because the arrangement required presence. She had been talking to someone he didn't know, and her face had been doing something he couldn't see from where he was standing, but her posture had been, the word he used was alive, and then he'd crossed it out and written, present in a way that made the room around her look less real by comparison. He had taken the photograph without thinking about it. He had taken others. Not surveillance. She understood the distinction reading his careful explanation of it, and believed him, because the description of the photographs themselves made that clear. Her hands around a coffee cup, the back of her head at a window, the particular angle of her when she was concentrating on something. A dozen photographs over 3 years, developed in the darkroom he'd had built in the basement for the architecture project and never mentioned to anyone. He wrote, "I am telling you this because you deserve to know the full inventory of what I did and didn't do. I watched you for 3 years, and I didn't tell you because I didn't know what telling you would mean. I'm telling you now because not telling you anymore is its own kind of dishonesty, and I've been dishonest enough." The 4th page was short. He wrote, "I'm not asking you to forgive the sentence. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking you to know that what happened in this house over the last few weeks was not something I manufactured. I don't know how to manufacture it. I've spent my adult life being very good at managing situations, and I was not managing you. I was failing, mostly, at knowing what to do with something I hadn't planned for. The sentence at the club was a failure. The evening in the kitchen was not. Both of those are true at the same time, and I don't know how to reconcile them except to tell you both." He had signed it with his first name only. Charlotte sat with the 4 pages in her lap for a long time. The house was quiet around her. Somewhere below she could hear the faint sounds of it settling. The radiator, a door, the particular vocabulary of a building at night. She had lived in this house for 3 years and learned its sounds the way you learn the sounds of any place you sleep in regularly without meaning to. The way the body absorbs information the mind doesn't bother to file. She thought about a dark room in the basement she'd never known existed. She thought about a man standing in a doorway at 6 in the morning and retreating upstairs without making coffee. She thought about the fennel, about the dish towel, About the painting in blues and grays and the quiet, specific way he'd said it looked like something felt instead of made. She folded the pages back into their original creases. She put them in the envelope. She put the envelope in the front pocket of her carry-on bag where she would be able to reach it on the plane. Then she lay down on top of the covers with her shoes still on and closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. She didn't expect to. But she lay there in the quiet and let everything sit where it was without trying to reorganize it, which was its own kind of rest. At 5:30 in the morning, she got up, washed her face, changed her clothes. She went downstairs. He was already in the kitchen. She hadn't expected that either. It was too early even for him, and for a moment she stood in the doorway the way he had stood, once, watching her, before she moved into the room. He had made coffee. 2 cups, already poured, the way she'd done the morning she'd read about Vitelli in the cab. Something about the symmetry of that settled into her ribs. She sat down. She took the cup. "I read it," she said. He was standing at the counter. He turned slightly, not fully, and nodded once. "The photographs," she said. "Yes." "Where are they?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he went out of the kitchen and came back 2 minutes later with a flat, unmarked envelope. He set it on the table in front of her and stepped back. She opened it. There were 11 photographs. Small, the way film photographs are. Actual size, not enlarged, with the slight grain and particular warmth of the medium that digital doesn't replicate. She went through them slowly. She had never seen herself the way these photographs saw her. Not because they were flattering, some of them weren't exactly, in the conventional sense, but they were specific. Each one was specific in the way that means someone was paying attention to the thing itself and not the idea of the thing. Her hands were in 3 of them, which she found difficult to look at for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate. Her hands doing ordinary things, holding a cup, turned palm up on a table, pressed flat against a window. The one of the back of her head at the window was the last one. She stared at it. It was from this house. The window in the upstairs hallway. She recognized the particular proportions of it, the way the light hit the glass. She didn't know when he'd taken it. She didn't remember standing there, but she was standing there in the photograph, looking out at something the photograph couldn't show. And the quality of her in it was, she searched for what she meant, private. Not exposed, private. Like something he'd been trusted with rather than taken. She put the photographs back in the envelope. She left the envelope on the table. "Keep them," she said. "I'll see them again when I come back." The silence that followed had weight. Not uncomfortable weight. The weight of something acknowledged. "When you come back," he said. Not a question. Something more careful than a question. 2 months, she said. "We said 2 months." "Yes." She drank her coffee. He stood at the counter. The kitchen was gray with early morning, and outside Chicago was doing its slow winter startup. The city reluctant, always, to begin another day in November. "What will you do?" she asked. Actually, with the 2 months. He was quiet for long enough that she knew he'd thought about it already. "There's a therapist Rourke's been suggesting for 2 years. I've been finding reasons not to go." He paused. "I'm going to stop finding reasons." She looked at him. "And I'm going to call my brother," he said. "Daniel. We haven't spoken in 18 months. I've been constructing reasons why the next call should come from him. I'm going to stop." She remembered him telling her about Daniel on the rainy Wednesday. The brother who'd stopped speaking to him. She'd stored it alongside the fennel and the dish towel and the 14-year-old who'd walked into a meeting he wasn't supposed to see. All the pieces of a person she'd been accumulating without acknowledging she was collecting them. "What will you say to him?" she asked. "I don't know yet." He looked at his coffee. "Something honest. The way you keep asking me to do things." She almost said something then. Something that lived in the warmth she'd been keeping carefully in its compartment. She held it back. Not because she didn't mean it, but because it needed the 2 months more than it needed to be said right now. Some things are smaller than they should be when they're said too soon. She finished her coffee. She picked up her bags. He drove her to the airport in the gray morning with the heat on and the radio off, and neither of them filled the silence with things that didn't need saying. It was the most companionable silence she'd experienced in 3 years of living alongside him, which told her something about the distance they'd traveled in the past few weeks, and she sat with that without examining it too closely. At the departures curb, he got out of the car and took her bags from the trunk. He set them on the sidewalk beside her. He stood in the cold in his coat with his hands at his sides. She looked at him. 2 months, she said. 2 months, he said. She picked up her bags. She went through the doors. She did not look back, because she'd made a decision, and looking back would have made it harder without making it better. And she had learned over a long life of difficult decisions that the kindest thing you can do for yourself is complete them cleanly. She found her gate. She sat down. She put her carry-on under the seat in front of her and felt the envelope in the front pocket and let her hand rest near it for a moment and then took her hand away. She watched the planes through the window. She thought about Montana, about her cousin Darla, who was meeting her at the arrivals gate, who'd been asking her to visit for 4 years and who would not, Charlotte knew, ask too many questions right away, because Darla understood the value of giving people room to arrive. She thought about what arriving might feel like, being somewhere that had no architecture of arrangement around it, no functions to attend, no appearances to, no man in the kitchen at 7 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee already poured. She thought, I need this. Not as a punishment, not as a test. I need to know what I am when I'm not navigating something. The flight boarded. She slept for the first time in days somewhere over Wisconsin, her head against the window and the envelope in the bag under the seat. And the sleep was the specific kind that comes after sustained adrenaline, deep and without dreams, the body collecting what it's owed. She woke up over Montana. The landscape below was extraordinary in the way she'd forgotten landscapes could be. The scale of it, the indifference of it, mountains that did not care at all about Chicago, or arrangements, or sentences delivered in hallways. She pressed her cheek against the cold of the window and looked down and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightened for so long she'd stopped noticing it. Darla was at the gate with a sign, which Charlotte hadn't expected and which made her laugh for the first time in what felt like a significant number of days. The sign said Charlotte in large letters, and underneath it, in smaller letters, finally. She hugged her cousin for a long time. Darla drove her to the house, a real house, not a mansion, a house that had a porch and a dog named after a president, and the particular smell of wood smoke and old furniture that means somewhere people actually live. Charlotte sat on the porch on the first afternoon with a cup of tea and the dog's head on her foot and looked at mountains until the light changed. She didn't talk about the marriage for the first 3 days. Darla didn't ask. On the 4th day, Charlotte sat at the kitchen table and told her cousin the whole thing, start to finish. The arrangement, the rainy Wednesday, the pasta, the hallway, the 2 weeks, the dinner with Caruso, the letter with 4 pages, all of it. Darla listened the way she had always listened, completely, without rushing toward a response, letting each thing land before the next one arrived. When Charlotte finished, Darla was quiet for a moment. "Do you love him?" she asked. Charlotte had been waiting for the question and still didn't have a clean answer. "I don't know what I've had time to become," she said. "That's the problem. Every version of us has been inside a situation. I've never known him when nothing was happening." "That's fair," Darla said. "But," Charlotte said and stopped. "But," Darla said. "But the photographs," Charlotte said. "He took photographs of my hands." Darla looked at her. "He didn't tell me. He wasn't showing me. He just documented me for 3 years because he was paying attention." Charlotte looked at the table. "I've been in rooms with a lot of people who were paying attention to what I could do for them. He was paying attention to," she stopped, found the word, "to me, just me." Darla reached across the table and put her hand over Charlotte's. They sat like that for a while. Montana did what Charlotte had needed it to do, which was to give her back the version of herself that existed outside of context. She found her in small things, the particular satisfaction of making coffee in a kitchen that wasn't loaded with meaning, the physical relief of long walks in cold air that smelled like pine and stone, the slow reacquisition of her own thoughts when they weren't organized around navigating someone else's landscape. She called her lawyer in Chicago and began the preliminary work on a new business. Not the old cafe, something different, something she'd been turning over for years. A roaster, small batch, direct trade, the kind of operation that was more warehouse than cafe, but that would eventually supply a dozen independent shops in the city. She spent 3 weeks building the business plan with the same focused energy she'd brought to the cafe 6 years ago, and found that the work felt clear in a way that told her she was thinking correctly again. She did not call Damien. He did not call her. He texted twice. Both times were small things, not declarations, not inquiries. The first was a photograph of the kitchen window on a morning that had clearly snowed overnight. Just the image and no text, sent on the 3rd week. She sat with her phone and looked at the snowy window for a long time, and then put it face down on the table and went back to her business plan. The second was a link to a review of a restaurant that had opened on North Clark, with a one-sentence note. The chef's from Boston. Thought you'd want to know. She read this at 9 in the morning in Darla's kitchen and felt warmth move through her so specifically and precisely that she had to stand up and go to the window. She texted back, "I'll add it to the list." She stared at her own response for a moment. Then she put her phone away. Week 5, she called Daniel Calloway. She found his number through a contact she'd developed over 3 years of adjacent proximity to the organization's edges. Not a mafia contact, just a person who knew things, who knew people. She called Daniel directly, not to report or to mediate, but because it had been nagging at her since the morning she'd left. He picked up on the 3rd ring. He had Damien's voice in the lower registers, but a different quality to it, less compressed, less managed. The voice of someone who hadn't spent years flattening the parts of himself that were dangerous to show. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, when she identified herself. Carefully neutral. "Charlotte, please," she said. "I'm calling because I want to tell you something, and I want to tell you directly rather than through anyone else." "All right. Your brother is—" She chose the words with the same care she'd brought to the Crane interview. "He's been doing things differently. I don't know what that means for whatever happened between you. That's not my business. But I wanted you to hear it from someone who has no reason to manage what you think about him." Silence on the line. Enough that she wondered if she'd miscalculated. Then, "How differently?" "He made an appointment," she said, "with a therapist. He went." She knew this because Rourke had told her, through a text that read simply, "He went," which was the most concise and complete message she'd received from anyone in weeks. "And he was going to call you." Was. Is, she corrected herself. "I don't know the timing." Another silence. "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked. Not hostile, genuinely asking. "Because the people around him have reasons to manage your perception of him," she said. "And I don't. And I thought you deserved to have one piece of information that wasn't being filtered." She heard him exhale slowly. "He called me last week," Daniel said. She closed her eyes briefly. "Good. It wasn't a good call. It was hard. He's not good at it." "No," she said. "He's not." "But he called," Daniel said. "Yes." She heard something shift in his voice, not resolution, something more tentative than that. The shape of someone deciding whether to take a step that might not support their weight. I'll call him back, he said. I was going to. I needed to think about it. Okay, she said. Charlotte, he said. Yes. Are you coming back? She looked out Darla's kitchen window at the mountains, at the enormous, indifferent, beautiful landscape that had been doing its slow work on her for 5 weeks. Yes, she said. She flew back to Chicago on a Tuesday morning, 2 months and 3 days after she'd left. She hadn't told him the exact date. She'd told him 2 months, and she'd taken 2 months plus 3 days, and the 3 extra days were her own. Not a power move, not a test, just 3 days she needed to be certain that what she was walking back toward was real, and not just the gravitational pull of something familiar. On the last evening in Montana, she sat on the porch with the dog and watched the sun go behind the mountains and thought about what she wanted her life to look like. Not what was practical, not what was available, what she actually wanted. She wanted the roaster. She'd been certain of that for weeks. She wanted Darla, who had given her the gift of uncomplicated presence for 2 months without asking for anything in return, who was a person Charlotte had undervalued for years by being too busy with the logistics of surviving to invest in the people who made surviving worthwhile. She wanted, and this was the part she'd spent the most time with, turning it carefully the way you turn something delicate to find all its sides. She wanted to find out whether what she and Damien had found in the middle of a crisis was something that could exist outside of one. She wanted to know the answer to that question honestly, which meant she had to go back and ask it. She was not going back to the arrangement. She was going back to the question. He was at the airport. She saw him before he saw her. She came through the arrivals gate, and he was standing near the far wall rather than at the gate itself, which was considerate in the way she'd come to recognize his particular brand of consideration. Understated, not performed, doing the thing rather than announcing it. He was in a coat she hadn't seen before, and he looked, across the distance of the arrivals hall, like a man who had been using the 2 months for something. He saw her. She walked toward him. They stood a few feet apart. She had her bags. He didn't reach for them immediately, which she appreciated. You look different, he said. Montana does that, she said. How is it? Good. Beautiful. The dog is named Roosevelt, something at the corner of his mouth, after the president. Which one, Darla won't say. He reached then for the larger of her bags, and she let him take it, which was its own kind of communication. Small, quiet, the language of two people figuring out what they're allowed to do with each other. They went to the car. He drove with his hands at 10 and 2, the way he always did, which she realized she'd noticed before without cataloging. She cataloged it now. The Crane piece published, he said. I know, I read it. It was fair, she said. I know, she said she would be. A pause. Daniel called me, he said. I know. He glanced over. She met it directly. You called him, he said. I called him, she said, to tell him what I observed, not to manage anything. He had a right to one piece of information that wasn't filtered. He looked back at the road. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't thank me for it. It was the right thing to do independently of you. I know, he said. I know that's why you did it. That's why I'm thanking you. She looked out the window at Chicago coming back toward her. The lake visible to the right, gray and enormous, and exactly as it always was, indifferent to how much time had passed or what had happened in its absence. I'm not moving back into the main bedroom, she said. I know. I want the guest suite for now. It's yours. And I need to be able to work without the house being involved in any operational. She paused. Whatever comes through the house in terms of the organization's business, I need it to be separate from the spaces we share, fully. I've already made those arrangements. She looked at him. You assumed I was coming back. I hoped, he said. There's a difference. She looked back at the road ahead of them. I'm starting a roaster, she said. Small batch. There's a warehouse space on the west side I've been in contact with the owner about. I'm going to need your property contacts to run the due diligence, and I'll pay market rate for the access, and I won't let it blur into anything else. Okay. I'm serious about the separation. I know you are, he said. I'm not going to compromise that. She believed him. She was still, after everything, a person who trusted her own reading of people, and she trusted this. They pulled onto the street. The mansion came into view, lit from within, which meant Rourke or someone had turned the lights on before they arrived. She sat in the passenger seat and looked at the building that had been her address for 3 years and felt the particular strangeness of returning to a place that was both familiar and newly uncertain. What did you do with the 2 months? She asked. All of it, not just the therapy and Daniel. He parked the car. He turned it off. He sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel. I spent the first 3 weeks figuring out what I actually want the organization to look like in 5 years, he said. There's a version of what my father built that I've been maintaining because I inherited it and hadn't stopped to ask whether it was the version I'd have built myself. He paused. It isn't. What is the version you'd have built? Smaller, he said. More selective. Less built on fear as its primary operating mechanism. He looked at the steering wheel. Fear is efficient in the short term, but it requires constant maintenance, and it produces people like Vitelli who are always waiting for weakness because fear taught them that's the only thing worth watching for. Charlotte thought about this. What happened with Vitelli? She asked. He's gone, Damien said. Not, he looked at her. Not violently. He was given an exit, generous terms. He took them. She nodded. He knew his position wasn't recoverable, Damien said. When Caruso filed opposition, the math was clear. He's in Florida. Permanent? Permanent. She looked at the house. Let's go in, she said. They went in. The kitchen was the same kitchen. She'd expected it to feel strange, and it did, but not in the way she'd anticipated. Not alienating. Strange in the way that coming back to a place always is, the slight mismatch between the remembered version and the present one. He mud coffee. She sat at the table and watched him do it with the particular attention she'd been applying to things since Montana. Unhurried, let it be what it is attention. He set the cup in front of her. He sat down across from her. I went to the gallery, he said, 3 weeks ago. Without a function as an excuse, I just went. What did you see? The painting, he said, the one I told you about. He wrapped both hands around his own cup. I stood in front of it for a long time, and I realized the reason I've been going back to it for 7 years is that I've been trying to understand the feeling, what it was, why the artist made the painting he made instead of something else. He paused. And I understood it this time. I understood it because I've had the same feeling. I know what it is now. Charlotte looked at him across the table. You don't have to say it, she said. I want to, he said, not to pressure anything, just because I told you I was going to stop being dishonest about inventory. Okay, she said. I love you, he said. I have for a long time. I didn't know what to do with it, so I took photographs of your hands and retreated upstairs at 6 in the morning and said the worst possible thing in a room full of men because I was afraid of what it meant that I'd run out of ways to pretend I didn't. The kitchen was very quiet. Charlotte looked at the man across the table from her. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the photographs, specifically without the softening lens of what she wanted to see, just what was there, the tired intelligence of him. The particular stillness that was both his greatest skill and his greatest limitation, and was currently being held very carefully in check so that he wasn't using it to manage this moment. The open quality of his face, which cost him something she understood because she knew enough about him now to know what the alternative looked like. She thought about what she'd said to Darla. I've been in rooms with a lot of people who were paying attention to what I could do for them. She thought about 11 photographs, small, with the grain of film, her hands in 3 of them. I know, she said. He waited. I'm not there yet, she said. At the word, I need us to be something for a while that isn't inside a crisis. I need to know what we are when nothing is happening. Okay. But I'm here, she said. I came back because I wanted to, because the question matters to me and I want to answer it honestly. She held his gaze. That's not nothing. That's everything, he said. She almost argued with the scale of it. She didn't. They drank their coffee. The kitchen was warm in the way kitchens are when there's been something good recently in them, even if the good thing was just 2 people sitting across a table from each other in the early dark. Outside Chicago in January, brutal and indifferent and enormous, the lake probably the color of iron tonight, the wind doing what it did to anyone foolish enough to be out in it. Inside, a table, 2 cups. The specific quiet of 2 people who have been through something and are, for the moment, on the other side of it. 3 weeks later, she signed the lease on the warehouse. He came to see it with her, not because she asked, but because she mentioned she was going on Tuesday. And he said, without maneuvering, that he had Tuesday morning free if she wanted company. She said yes because she did. They walked through the empty space with its high ceilings and concrete floors, and she explained where the roasters would go, where the bagging operation would set up, where the small tasting room she wanted would eventually be built out. He listened the way he'd always listened when she talked about work, completely, asking the questions that connected to previous things she'd said. At one point, he walked to the far wall and looked up at the windows. Industrial, north-facing, the light coming through them gray and clean. And she watched him look and thought about him standing in a gallery in front of a painting in blues and grays, trying to understand a feeling. Good bones, he said. I know, she said. He turned around. He was standing in the middle of her new enterprise with his hands in his coat pockets and the north-facing light on him and the expression she'd finally found a name for, the one she'd been trying to catalog for months. It was the expression of someone fully present, not managing, not calibrating, just there, in the room, in the moment, paying attention to the specific thing in front of him. She crossed the concrete floor and stood beside him. She didn't take his hand yet. She stood beside him, and they looked at the north-facing windows together, at the gray, clean light coming through. And she felt the specific quality of being next to a person and choosing to be there, which is different from every other way of being next to someone. And she let herself feel it fully without putting it away. I'm going to need a good coffee set up for the tasting room, she said. Obviously, he said. Not commercial grade. Something thoughtful. I might know someone who has opinions about that. She glanced over at him. Do you? He's very particular about stock. She laughed. It came out easily, without work, the kind that means you've come back to a version of yourself that can do this again. He looked at her when she laughed, the way he had in the kitchen that first night, with the careful quality of someone encountering something they hadn't anticipated, except different from that night. That night had been surprise. This was something that had had time to become familiar and still hadn't lost its effect on him, which is a different and more durable thing. She stopped laughing. They stood in the warehouse with the north-facing light and the smell of concrete and the enormous fact of two people who had arrived at the same place by one of the more improbable routes available. "Okay," she said. "Okay, what?" he said. She looked at him, at the full specific inventory of him. "Okay," she said again, "just that, just the word." He was still for a moment. Then he took his hands out of his pockets. He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any of the weight she might have expected the gesture to carry. Just took it, the way you take hold of something you've decided you're not going to put down again. She let him. They stood like that for a while in the empty warehouse. Outside, Chicago continued to be exactly what it was. Brutal and cold and enormous, indifferent to the particular small warmth of two people standing in a room, holding on. It did not care. They did not need it to.